October 22nd presentation, Sandbox presentation. And tonight we're going to take a quick look at something called holographic reality. It's been something that's been brewing for at least 10 years or so or longer. Basically, it talks about how our perception. But before we do that, we'll take a quick look at last week's session. And at that time, we looked at games and scripts. And under games, we examined a fairly common game, the victim triangle, and identified the fact that no one in that particular game really is happy or okay, and that one of the solutions to that particular game, and perhaps any kind of games that people might play, is to stay in the ego state as much as possible and to not be pulled into becoming parental or becoming childlike. Then we looked at scripts, long-term and short-term scripts, and we used the victim triangle as an example of a short-term script that you or someone else might play frequently. And in terms of long-term scripts, I gave an example of my lifelong script. And we talked about the fact that one of the approaches to uh, improving one's script, because it's great to have scripts, there's nothing wrong with them, when they're conscious and they're doing what you want. So there's a gentleman, John Bradshaw, who's been doing a lot of work on something called the inner child, healing the inner child, which is kind of similar to the timeline work that we've done. I also presented two options for dealing with games and scripts and icons and things of that nature. You can work with your internal map of reality, understand how it works, and improve it for yourself. Develop your values, develop your beliefs so that they're all consistent. And there's another option which I presented, which was basically stepping out of the map and just basing your life decisions on outcomes and being fully responsible for the outcomes based on your experiences. When we looked at metaprograms, again, I gave an example of the range from being very detailed, very associated, looking at the facts and judging, to the other end where you're looking at the big picture, you're disassociated, you're more intuitive or perceptive. And I just want to point out here that this is not a fixed example. In one example I show some people playing sports and being very focused and detailed, and the other, someone having fun playing the piano. But it could just as easily be the reverse, that someone enjoying music could be very associated, very into the music, very much paying attention to the details of if the case was a piano, and making instantaneous judgments about what he or she plays. And similarly, if someone's playing sports, they may be very disassociated, focused on the big picture, being very intuitive and perceptive. It's whatever works best for you. And the key here is identify when you are in the proper alignment of these internal programs that makes sense for you. So that's self-discovery. So it's whatever works for you. And in terms of lifelong scripts, the example I gave here was my history. This is a lifelong script. I've been running this script, covers many, many, many years, my whole life. And I could write a story. I could write a very cohesive story linking all of these four components together to explain why I'm doing what I'm doing now. Okay. We're moving now into this whole idea of the holographic universe, and the issue is that in our reality there's energy and there's matter. If here is a fairly recent revision of the states of matter and energy. And it's pretty well accepted now that as energy increases, so does frequency. The faster things move, the hotter they get, and they change states. So on the right hand side, you see states ranging from solid right on up to liquid to gas to plasma and to photonic type energy, right up to the fastest moving particles that we know. So the interesting thing here, I just want you to note that as frequency increases, things are less solid. There's a connection between energy, frequency, and solidity. So just keep that in mind. When we're talking about perception, it is in fact a one-way activity. We see, hear, smell, taste, and touch. We're taking it in. We're not changing it in a sense that it is what it is. You see what you see, and it is a one-way flow of information. When we do that, there's a conversion, and this is what makes it very interesting. You know, when we're hearing something, we mechanically process it. Then there's a chemical phase to it, and that ends up as an electrical phase that we process in our brains. Our brains have the ability to take what we perceive, correct it, adjust it, because it's sampling, make any substitutions necessary so that we perceive our reality in a seamless, uninterrupted fashion. And in some cases, there's been some research to show that the brain actually fills in the blanks for us. So when we look at something like hearing, here are the three phases where the outer ear is very mechanical. There's a little drum that beats as the frequencies, vibrations hit the outer ear. Then in the middle ear, it gets amplified through the little devices inside the middle ear. And when it gets into the inner ear, in the cochlea, there's an actual chemical process that takes place, I believe it's a release of sodium atoms that get translated to the electrical energy that flows down the nerve, and then we actually perceive the sound. Similar thing happens when we see. The light comes through a physical lens, hits the rods in the back of the eye, and if there's enough photons of light, I believe for humans we need 20, and for frogs we need at minimum 8. But for humans we need around 20 photons hitting the rods before we perceive light. And when the rods get stimulated, they again release electrical charge, which we then process as vision. So the question is, when you look at a candle, where is the light? It goes through the mechanical, chemical, and electrical process, and we perceive light somehow in our brain. So what is it we are perceiving? You might at this point say, well, gee, Steve, why is this important? Why is it important to look at how we are perceiving things and creating our reality? What the heck, everything seems to work just fine. Well, some of the biggest minds that we have on the planet today are battling with the whole concept of reality at a very, very interesting and dynamic level. Leonard Susskind and Stephen Hawking faced off. Now, these are two bigwigs, so what does it take to actually challenge Stephen Hawking? I don't know. You really have to be pretty sure of what you're saying. And there was an issue about something Stephen said about black holes. He said that energy and matter was lost, disappeared. And this was not acceptable by Dr. Susskind, so they argued about it, and the conclusion that they came up to, that they're both happy with now, is rather startling. There was a gentleman, Michael Talbot, that produced a book some time ago called The Holographic Universe, in which he said the universe is just information and it's a hologram. And this is basically a follow-up of something that an earlier scientist did, quantum mechanics physicist, Richard Friedman, when he showed and he explained the double slit experiment. And those of you who have not seen the double slit experiment, you might want to just take a peek at it. There's lots of examples of it on the internet. But, but here you can see in the little diagram the waves approaching the two holes, and then you get this interference pattern coming out. The important thing here is that it's the interference pattern that we see. The particles are a representation of how waves interact. And on the left, it just looks like a bunch of bars, but when you see the right side of the double slit, it's an interesting pattern of particles. So when we look at something, we can't see the wave. We can't see the energy. We can only see a moment of it. So we collapse, what they call collapsing the wave function, to see a particle. But what's really out there is waves. And scientists now pretty much accept across the board that the universe looks like the globe on the left-hand side, a bunch of interference waves rather interacting, and what we see on the right-hand side is a representation of all this wave activity. So you might just want to relax for a second and think for the fact that there's a lot of activity happening around us, and part of the filtration process that we do in the brain in order to perceive reality is to pick out the interference patterns that make sense to us, and we make a representation of them inside. So this is what we see on the inside. We see a nice galaxy out there, but really it's much more complicated than that. It's more like the image on the left, in fact, a hologram. And perhaps one of the most renowned scientists out there, Albert Einstein, he kind of understood that reality is an illusion. It's a persistent one, but it's an illusion. There's more out there than we can process at any one time. So that's pretty much it for the holographic reality. Just a teaser. If you're interested, you may want to go out there, take a look around at some articles. There's plenty of videos out on this. I would recommend you start with the Leonard Susskind series of videos on quantum mechanics, black holes, and the holographic universe. He makes an excellent presentation, and Richard's information is excellent as well. So that's it for tonight, and we'll do a little exercise. And for you watching on YouTube, thank you for joining and giving me the opportunity to share this information.